everyone. My name is Lydia and my pronouns are she, her. Um, and so thinking about this question, I thought, I think my core passion has a lot to do with the fact that I spent a lot of time as a child playing outside by myself. And so there's this kind of intersection of storytelling and environmental justice that I hold very dear, um, and how place can shape story and vice versa. And lately, thinking about how um, reparations can and should involve land as a tool for community wealth building. And in my role here, I think a lot about what happens when reporters are actually trauma informed and can shape the stories of communities impacted by racism, gender-based violence, sexual violence in a way that, you know, is more truthful, dignifying, equitable, all of those things. And then also I'm interested in how we can push the conversation around mental health to be more holistic and take into account lived experiences and as well as ancestral experiences. And I feel like that is one of those conversations that I could see really fitting well into this forum idea, with intergenerational discussions around, health, healing, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Go ahead, jump in at any point. Looks like Ellie, you're ready to go.
Well, I'm just sitting here, but thanks, Mickey. Hi, everyone. I will certainly watch my time. I'm Ellie Krug. I'm transgender. That's why the voice doesn't match the appearance. I am a speaker and a trainer on human inclusivity and diversity. I speak and train across the country, but I'm also a lawyer by training and experience, formerly almost 30 years as a civil trial lawyer. Um, you know, and Mickey and Shelley have heard this from me. If you ask me what's the one thing that we all need to be talking about, we need to be talking about fear. Why are we so afraid? And the fear is driving our country apart right now. We're quickly, very quickly, falling into groups, we against them. And it is happening literally as we speak. And it does, and I don't want to scare anybody, okay? But it's our democracy is at risk because of this. And I think that as women are we're the peacemakers. We're the ones who care about our children. I mean, not that fathers and dads don't care about their children, but not that I ever birthed a kid, okay? But there's this relationship between women and the children that they birth, and I do not mean to marginalize anybody who is childless, either by choice or not by choice. But I absolutely think that we need to have conversations about how do we protect the children? How do we create a country that has the values that we want for our children going forward? And how do we start talking to each other again as a country? And I believe that it's only women that are going to be able to cause the country to talk to each other again. The men, it's just, there's all kinds of things caught up with that. So that's where I think that we should be. Thanks.
And Sarah, I know you've got a little bit of a time crunch today, so I'm going to have you go next.
Sure, yeah. My name is Sarah. I use she, her pronouns. I am with Reviving the Islamic Sisterhood for Empowerment, or RISE. We are actually volunteering tonight to put together iftar boxes for our community. So I'm going to switch over to my phone at 5:30, but I'll still try to be listening in to all of you. Super excited to get you. I am the storytelling program manager at RISE. And so what I am particularly passionate about is how storytelling feeds into movement building. At RISE, our mission is to amplify the voice and power of Muslim women. And ultimately, we want to challenging gendered Islamophobia. And for us, storytelling is a critical part of that because we can't have societal change without narrative change. Other topics that I think are really pertinent to our communities, women and faith. So, you know, for a lot of us, it's our faith that really propels us to action and inspires us, keeps us going in the midst of chaos and challenges. Um, and I would say also abolitionism, because we often think of that through like a racial or a class lens, but really there are so many implications for gender. And I think in a lot of ways, abolition is the way to liberation. So those are some things that come to mind for me, but you know, I don't think there's any one topic that like women or marginalized genders in Minnesota are gonna, you know, care about as we should.
All right, who wants to jump in next? How about Christina?
Yeah, I can go. Hola, everyone. I'm Cristina Escobar. I am the Director of Communications and Marketing for Casa de Esperanza, the National Latino Network. We are a nearly 40-year-old organization founded in the St. Paul area, working to mobilize the Latinx community to end gender-based violence. And have had the pleasure of working with Mickey on some pieces in the past, and hopefully some more in the future, spotlighting that work. You know, for me, and that particular work that we do, what I see as sort of most important is addressing and lifting up the ways in which, not that just that gender-based violence is occurring, but the ways in which women, particularly women of color, are standing up against it, changing laws, building movements, changing norms, and that importance of that work and that movement. I think sometimes in the women's space that gets kind of pushed aside. And I don't think that's doing us any favor. I don't see it happening at the women's press, but more broadly, I do think that happens. And another place that I think is really important to lift up is generally women of color's leadership. One of our people who work in policy was recently looking at some, it's not released yet, so I can't share it with you, but some data they had done, a survey on how folks had reacted to Kamala Harris and her role in running for vice president. And the general feeling was that particularly among white folks, the sort of fear of her taking over, of her being bossy, of her only looking out for herself and sort of not getting the benefit of the doubt, I would say, in the same ways that we give people who look like traditional quote unquote leaders. But when I look back at social justice movements and movements for change, I see women of color at the forefront of those. So I think when we look and see about what sort of world we want to create, I think we need to look and see who we're following and line up behind them.
Okay. Mary, I'm just checking in. Are you able to hear us? Oh yeah, it looks like you're unmuting. Do you want to say something, Mary?
Sure, bonjour. Mary Sam Majita Zibikwe, Indigenous Cause, Mary Sam. I am a mother, grandmother, great-grandmother living in the Mille Lacs community. I'm also the Dean of Students Equity and Inclusion at Central Lakes College in Brainerd Staples, Minnesota. And I really appreciate what everybody has shared so far. Gosh, I had a long list of all kinds of things as well. You know, fear, you know, why are we so afraid? You know, I think about, you know, I grew up in the urban area and I've lived back up in my community here for the last, you know, 20 years. And just thinking about white rural America and the fear that's up here is just shocking. And, you know, we see that in the media. We see where the votes go. We see white women silenced. And, you know, how do we reach out to and open the door, challenge in a safe way rural women in rural America to find safe places, to have a voice, right? And where are those safe places? And marginalized women as well, or indigenous, my indigenous community. So, you know, how do we address silence? How do we address safety? How do we address fear in rural communities around the DEI discussion? Loved what you said, Ellie. You know, where do we find conversations and safe places to understand difference versus destruction? And then I think the other area for me is not just in my community, in the indigenous community, but, you know, across the nation, we hear a lot about abuse by men in power, you know, clergy, spiritual leaders, and therapists. And, you know, how do we provide women the tools to self-advocate, to interview, you know, select a healer that's safe and know how to do that, right? We hear a lot about clergy abuse with young men, and but we don't hear a lot about, you know, abuse of women. And so those are just my thoughts initially. I think this is a great opportunity, and I would be happy and honored to help in any way that I can. Miigwech.
Mary, it's good to talk. It's good to hear from you. I think we met each other when I was up in Brainerd 3 years ago.
Yes, yes. And I am actually driving right now. I have to be at a commencement activity here in a couple of minutes, so I will probably only be on the phone for about 10 minutes. I apologize, but wanted to be a part of the conversation. Thanks, Mickey.
So I can go next because I'll have to switch over to phone too, so I can pick up my son. I have a 5-year-old and a 12-year-old, and it's spring. My name is Danielle Kilgo. I am new here to the Twin Cities. I moved the first week of June 2020, which was exciting and challenging and crazy. I am a journalism professor in the Hubbard School at the U in the Twin Cities, and I study journalism and power dynamics, basically. I'm also sort of a non-traditional journalist lover because my professional experience was in advocacy journalism for health. But what I studied for a really long time is police violence and protest coverage and the inequities in that coverage. When I think about topics that I think are really important to think about, especially those that don't see in the mainstream press a lot, are just the intersectionality between specific things. I've been thinking a lot about environmental racism and a lot about the ableism that's going to happen post-pandemic and how people will return to normal and forget that we all just survived something very traumatic and awful. And I hope that in the next couple of years, news organizations don't forget to continue to tell that story, because the year of trauma that I experienced, I know I don't get over in the next 2 years, and the years I can't imagine how problematic and difficult it will be for people who lost one of the 500,000 plus people that died. So just thinking about equity and how and trauma and the pandemic is something I think is really important to consider. And then just cross issue solidarity in the first place, like when it comes to things like police violence against women, this happens across the racial boundaries, across the class boundaries, and thinking about ways to join those conversations together, so it's not still the divides between like feminism activism and racialized activism, because they should be together, working together to fill those causes. So it's nice to meet you all. And I'll develop a Minnesotan accent sooner or later, I promise. I adopt those well.
Mickey, you're muted.
Thank you. Thanks, Danielle. So Anna or Julia, who wants to jump in next? And Denise, I'm going to have you talk too at the end. I figure you get to absorb a bunch and then I'll have you talk.
This is Anna. I'm happy to jump in. Greetings, everyone. Anna Clausen here. I'm sorry I'm not on video. I am in Minneapolis. I live in Minneapolis. I am also a mother. I'm currently walking the neighborhood with my 8-month-old who needs a nap, and giving some space for my 3- and 5-year-old at this crazy time of the day. So grateful to be here. I am on a day's time, and my work lens and role. I'm the founder of Voices for Rural Resilience. And my organization, especially relevant here, stands in a lot of work that is rural-urban bridge building and focusing on rural-urban interdependence and leveraging storytelling, as many of you all do, for the power it has to do that work, but to make sure we're doing that work in a very humanizing way, in a healing way. I resonate with so much of what you've all said. Ellie, just picking up on fears. I think when I think about this question of what to focus on, what to discuss, I'm drawn more or less to what, but more about how we would have the conversation and to bring women together, put them in space for dialogue and conversation in a way that allows us to bring out our hopes and our fears. And also a lot of work that I think valuable, focusing on intersectionality, but also just complex identities. Ellie, when you talked about, the fear that's putting us into camps of different people. And Mary, you mentioned too, the silencing of white women in rural communities. I think we have to counter the ability that you don't have to be either or. That for myself, I'll give an example. I grew up in my family on a farm, and my family farms conventionally. And I've worked for decades in sustainable agriculture, but I would continue to run into spaces and people where it just didn't hold true truth that I could have a family that farms conventionally and be an advocate for a different type of agriculture and still love my family and love my father. And it's complex and it's complicated. So I think in all the conversations, regardless of what, bringing in story, bringing in ways that we're able to share more pieces of who we are, free of judgment, that somebody was going to say that it puts us in a certain camp or it puts us for or against or on a spectrum, would be valuable for our state, particularly for women in our state. Because I think a lot of women across all ethnicities and racial lines get silenced in that space. And I'm eager to hear, I follow many of your organizations and I love all this work. So I'm eager to be here. And I'm grateful for the invitation.
Thank you. Julia, we'll go to you, and then Denise, and then Lydia. I'm going to see if you have any questions you want to follow up with as the interview person you are.
All right, thank you. My name is Julia Gay. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm the Communications and Marketing Coordinator with the Coalition of Asian American Leaders. We also go by CAL for short. And I'm also kind of outside of my role at Cal. I'm also an artist, a practicing artist, playwright, comedian. I do stand-up comedy, and I dance and have danced with Ananya Dance Theater for the past 5+ years. So yeah, I hold a lot of different roles, and I think that they all come back to the importance of storytelling and the power of it. Right now in my role at Cal, I'm helping organize our storytelling campaign called Mini Asian Stories that actually is launching today, this month of May, APA Heritage Month. And so really taking this opportunity to uplift the really diverse experiences and voices of the Asian Minnesotan communities. And it feels particularly heavy and crucial work right now, kind of in light of just all of the anti-Asian racism we've seen both here in Minnesota and then also nationally. And so, yeah, this year's theme is Beyond the Myths and Monolith. And I think we continue to push against these preconceived notions of what it means to be Asian. And I think that also, I mean, just so much of what everyone has said so far is really, really crucial. And I think it highlights how much work there is to be done and how much work that is already being done. I think for me and NCAL's work, we are really interested in solidarity, and that that ultimately our work is in the service of our shared liberation. So how can we advance our own struggles, but also do it kind of step in step with all of our other communities? So yeah, that's a little bit of what's on my mind, what's on Cal's mind, and what we're working on. Thank you.
Okay, I can go. My name is Denise. I'm the new marketing intern for the Minnesota Women's Press. I am here just to like listen to you guys and just learn more about the work that the press does. And I can already tell that I'm very, very inspired. And yeah, I guess just a little bit about me and my interest. I think you guys all pretty much hit it on the nail. I think that I agree with all of you that there are very important stories that, you know, we can cover for years and years. There's never ever going to be, I think, a time when we can sit down and say we're done. I guess personally, I'm very interested in hearing stories about how women find ways to express themselves and to cope with their traumas through art, whether that be through writing, through sort of visual type of media. I've learned a lot. I'm a student at the U and I work with some departments, and I do have time to like read a lot of the work the professors and faculty do. And I think it's all very interesting, especially because there's so much behind it. And being here, I'm so glad that I'm hearing so many different important stories and concepts, that some of them that I've never even heard of, and I am really interested in looking forward to reading about. So yeah, looking forward to listening more about every wonderful thing you guys have to say.
Thank you, Denise. And yes, that was baptism by like, here, come and join us right now. Lydia, do you want to follow up with anything that you heard, things you're thinking of? And then we'll kind of have a question and answer discussion kind of thing with everybody, just while we have time.
Yeah, this is kind of like a loose question, but I'm wondering if anyone has any more thoughts on kind of what Anna was talking about with this thinking about safety in terms of these discussions, and how we can, yeah, what a safe space looks like how, like what, sorry, what like what are the requirements, or like what does it feel like to embody a safe space that is intersectional and you know, yeah, I'm just wondering if anyone has any thoughts about, you know, experiences that they've had, positive or negative, in these kinds of personal, you know, intimate discussions about issues, and what you thought was done right or done wrong in the past. But yeah, just wanted to follow up on the aspect of safety and fear in general.
Mickey, can I respond and just say, Lydia, I think that that's just a really, really great question. You know, after the Philando Castile murder, the city of Falcon Heights reached out to the state of Minnesota that has a mediation service and asked for them to bring circle leaders to Falcon Heights for community conversations around policing and disparities and all kinds of stuff. And you know what? Those were really, really great discussions, and they were very safe. They were, you know, when you have a circle, I'm assuming most people are familiar with the process of circle talks. You know, you've got a leader and you've got some rules about crosstalk and all of that stuff. But that really worked. And I think that, you know, they had a series of circles. So it was not just a one night. And when you came, it was not just one circle. I mean, there were multiple circles in the gym and all of that stuff. but I think that people appreciated that they had a say, that they could be heard. You know, there were tears, there were, you know, it was very emotional, but so that, to me, that's what when I think about safe spaces, that's the kind of safe space where people can come together and share how they're feeling.
This is Anna. If I can just jump on that, Elliot, it's a great example of the stories or story circles or circle spaces. I think, you know, I'm not a journalist as well. I really, good journalism, I just strive towards wanting to be in your circles and in your spaces. But I have been invited in some opinion journalism spaces on a national level and had some amazing discussions where it wasn't until I was in those spaces that I realized how it connected to the work that I was doing with storytelling and movement building, is that there needs to be so much space for people feeling heard. There's the story and who's going to hear it. And often when we're writing that, we're focused on who's going to read it, who's going to hear it. But the power of people giving off of their chest what matters to them and speaking it, and where that fits into someone's healing journey is something I'm fascinated by, because I think it's such an important area and such a sensitive one. Where there's sometimes when I work in rural communities across the country, sometimes I do say, yes, our communities don't feel heard, but I don't necessarily think it's always a megaphone they need. It's not necessarily just needing, you know, New York Times or others to come in and give them a big platform or media, because sometimes that means that story gets told and it dissipates. And when it comes back to their local community, there wasn't enough space for having that conversation in more depth on a more local level, at a regional level, and sort of what it looks like to create space locally for when somebody is willing to be courageous enough to tell their story. Are we creating networks to catch them within communities where I think sometimes the harshest criticism and feedback can come back to them, especially if they're sharing something that was maybe a hidden part of their identity or something they always thought they had to suppress and their community didn't know about that. And I also think that those are the spaces where the more ability we're able to create those safety nets with neighbors, within the local community, the more silenced voice, people whose voices feel silenced will come out in solidarity.
Can you hear me? This is Danielle. Maybe.
Yep.
Okay, just sorry, I'm on my phone now. I just would like to add, it's important how you define community too when you're thinking about these spaces. I mean, you can think about it geographically, but I think it's important to think about it beyond that, because you can be in the same suburb and not feel like you're a part of a community. So, you know, I think that when I think about how to craft and create safe spaces to have and hold these conversations, I often center the idea of grace and the grace we extend to others. But that also means that, you know, well, even like in my classes, that means that 60 people who are on Zoom that don't know each other have to pretend like they do. So like that, and that's a community, you know, that's a community of Minnesotans. And I feel like getting engaged on who wants to be involved in that community and what it requires, you know, to be committed to that community. I think that's a big part of knowing what creates the safeness. If you're thinking like the general, what's safe for women writers of marginalized topics, right? Across the board, I think that you would know that there's not a whole lot of safety in telling your story to just everyone. So I think just like if the point is to have smaller conversations like this has been discussed, I think it's important to just define what community is and where the boundaries are of it.
Mm-hmm. Christina, I'm wondering if you can jump in based on what you know with CASA, how that works.
How we build intentional community, is that the question? Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's a there's not a clear answer. You know, one of the things that I say is that I'm happy to discuss how to help the most people or how to help people the best, but I will not discuss who is a person who qualifies, who is worthy of dignity and respect. So to me, you have to start building community from that basic understanding of a shared humanity, whether we're talking about race or immigration status or sexuality or whatever it may be, ability. And so, but if you can start off with that shared common humanity, then it's about grace, as someone else mentioned. But I think it's also about humility. I don't think any of us have all of the answers, nor have all of us always been right. Ever. And so being able to say, I have made mistakes and I am learning an imperfect person. And that's what I look for other people to do, is to say, I'm on this point in this journey of towards social justice, what I hope is social justice. And I can forgive myself, but also be clear with you on my vulnerabilities, and I don't expect perfection, because I do think expecting perfection gets people scared to speak, to learn, to grow, and to engage. It's sort of this sometimes pressure to already have arrived, already have been perfect, and then we don't get any progress. So to me, I think it is, with that one caveat, right? The one caveat at the beginning that people have to respect the humanity of others. But if you can start with that, then to me, it's about being better, and all the time striving to be better, and not there being any other sort of litmus test. That's probably more me than Casa de Esperanza. I think I espouse some of their values, but that's been my personal findings as like a human who has worked in this space.
And that's fine. And I wanted to also say that, you know, as much as anything, you know, there's, again, particular reasons I reached out to each of you. And part of it is, you know, there's skills, there's lived experiences, but it's also not just about representing organizations. It's about what you've, you know, sort of gathered in your own storytelling ventures that I think can help us jointly create something, you know, that hopefully does serve the state of Minnesota in a new way. One of the initial thoughts I've had is that, you know, we do these, you know, every theme is different. We potentially lift up one or two articles from that issue. We have people in their own local communities potentially come around and discuss what those provoke in them. That's one idea. I don't know if that's the right idea, but that's the idea of having this board, is to get a sense of how people have helped make those connections. And I know when I was talking to Shelley and I were talking to Cheryl Hills and Dawn Espay at Region 5, who couldn't be here tonight. But one of the things they had lifted up, Anna, was one of the things you did for Voices for Rural Resilience, which is also taking the moment of a conversation and not having it just end there, but having it lead to the energy in that space, lead to something else, whether it's poetry or a song or something. I don't know if you want to say any more about what that was, but we've talked about that in the last week on staff, because it does feel like then you've co-created. I mean, it's all about co-creation. It feels like you've co-created something in the midst of that conversation, which compels more conversation down the road, bit by bit. That art piece of things, of storytelling as well. And so some of the people on our staff are going to start looking into what those might bring to some of the future forums that we're going to do. But I thought that was really interesting. Cheryl was very enamored with what those created. So Anna, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about what that entailed.
This is Mary. Can
Sure.
I just jump in? I've got to go, but
Okay.
I just want to say thank you, and I hope to be a part of the next conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Yep. See you.
Be well, Mary. Yeah, just briefly, I'll add some context. And I was saying I was delighted through the introductions and people introducing their their other roles as artists in the theater world, the dance world. Because so many of us have that skill set, but I don't think, and myself included, I identify as a photographer and first was trained that way, but often then don't use that when we get into more professional settings. But what we found is, I guess I paint the picture this way, and you probably can all relate. You know, I think the more in depth you get into a project, especially that requires you to synthesize something, the harder it gets to do it justice, to take somebody, and the more personal the story gets, the harder I think it is to turn that and articulate it back or weave it into another story. And we use artists. We've brought in poets. We've brought in illustrators. We've brought in songwriters through the process you're mentioning with Cheryl and Region 5. And I just can't say enough of how much, even in my work, I've done this before, but I don't feel like after this last project, I want to do any project that doesn't include artists. They are real time to help capture a conversation. Because it is a moment, it's a snapshot of the moment in time. And for our story circles, you know, we were talking about and how equity was intersecting in rural communities in northern Minnesota with food access was one of them. Another was with infrastructure. And they were very deep personal stories. And thankful to the artists, they all took their own unique approach to capturing it. And then there's just different ways for others in the community to relate to those stories and conversations ongoing after that point. I didn't talk too detailed, but that's just high level of how that approach worked in that process.
That being said, what questions, comments, thoughts do people want to jump in with before we close up at 6 o'clock?
So Mickey, my only comment is this: I'm in. However, however you want me or want this thing to be, I believe it. I believe in you. I believe in the magazine. I believe in your team. And I think that this is a really great idea because we have to have the state unified. It can no longer simply be the Twin Cities as just that's the state. It has to be from all places within the state. And I think that this is a really great vehicle for that to possibly happen. So just let me know what to do and I'll sign, I'll be there when you say, I hope.
All right, thank you.
Well, I think what I kept hearing in our internal conversations, and certainly in one of our initial conversations with Ellie, and that even pulled through in our conversation with Julie on Saturday, was about doing this different, and the importance of co-creating. And what a better outcome comes from that, because there's been far too much siloing going on in our world, and we see where that's led us. So, and I think in my experience, I've just been with the Minnesota Women's Press for a little over a year, but my experience is the beauty and the value that comes from different perspectives and different voices when they're working for peace and for harmony instead of division. So yeah, and co-creating.
Yeah. And I know one of the frustrations I had last year with the pandemic, among other things that we've all experienced and sorrows and traumas, is we were on the verge of starting to do a greater Minnesota outreach, and that obviously wasn't the right time. So because we've been very metro oriented, which has been really frustrating because that was something I had wanted to do by year 3, was expand some of that conversation. And then we've had some really great, the last couple months, forums where we had Mary Sam was one of them. Senator Kunish was on the call talking about the MMIR issue. And it's great to be able to lift up storytellers from our pages and then have other people be able to interact with them in the forum or listen to them in a forum. But there too, the frustrating part is you're just hearing a couple people and then you're done. And there's more that we need to do. So part of it is, yeah, figuring out how to do that and to very, very much be about statewide. And our June issue that we're just in the process of finishing in 2 weeks, very statewide, which is why the first forum we want to do is in June, because half of the content in that issue is from women around the country, around the state, who are kind of revitalizing their communities. There's one woman who's rebuilding with volunteers in her town of 600 an old school that was otherwise going to be demolished so that they can turn it into something like a community center. There's people from Lead from Minnesota, a couple of the women, one that's working on native language revitalization of Ojibwe, and another one who's working on childcare access in Hibbing. So there's these amazing, again, people, and I feel like that's the right time to try a forum that's done in a slightly different way. And then when we get to July, and again, these are things that were already our themes, so we're kind of in those parameters, but the idea would be to expand on how are we going to discuss fear? How do we discuss toxic masculinity? How do we do a variety of things that we haven't done this year? But the idea in July is it's about the elements. It's about land, water, air, and fire, which is, it's going to be a lot around regenerative agriculture and other things. And that's another one that is fantastic for some state conversations. Then we get further ahead, and it's gender-based violence. So these are really great forums, but I want to figure out how to do it differently, and that's what this is all about.